The Strait of Hormuz is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles separating the Persian Gulf from the Gulf of Oman, a ribbon of saltwater through which roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes every single day. On any given morning, you can stand on the Iranian coastline and see the tankers, massive, slow, and vulnerable, crawling through that channel like prehistoric animals. From Tehran's perspective, that geography has always looked like leverage, like a loaded gun pointed at the global economy. Like a choke point they could squeeze at will. They were wrong. And the story of why they were wrong, the story of how the United States Navy quietly, methodically, and almost invisibly repositioned the most sophisticated maritime warfare architecture in human history, is the story we're telling today. Because the most decisive victories in modern warfare aren't won in the flash of missile fire or the roar of a flight deck launch sequence. They're won in the years before the first shot is ever fired. They're won in engineering bays in Newport News, Virginia. They're won in classified operations centers in Bahrain. They're won in the silence between radar pings at 0300 hours in the North Arabian Sea, when nobody is watching except the people who built the systems to make sure nobody could watch back. In early October 2024, amid escalating tensions following strikes and counterstrikes in the region, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, CSG-3, received orders that moved it out of the Western Pacific and into the Central Command Theater with a speed that surprised even seasoned defense analysts. Simultaneously, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower CVN-69 had been operating in the Red Sea Theater since late 2023, absorbing the pressure of Houthi drone and missile campaigns with a regularity that felt almost routine to the officers aboard her. 2 carrier strike groups, roughly 160 aircraft, 14 surface combatants, at least 2 fast attack submarines whose positions were, and remain, classified. This wasn't a show of force. This was the architecture of a checkmate that had been built over decades, positioned over months, and executed without a single public announcement. What Iran saw was surface level, ships on water, planes in the sky, the same deterrence theater the U.S. Navy has performed since 1980. What Iran didn't see was the electromagnetic signature suppression aboard the Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers. What they didn't see was the layered and SPY, 6V radar network that can track a basketball-sized object from 550 nautical miles. What they didn't see was the submarine operating in water they thought they had mapped, the gap between what Iran believed was happening and what was actually happening. That gap is the story. That gap is where the U.S. Navy already won. To understand why Iran was structurally outmatched before the first crisis moment of 2024 arrived, you have to go back, far back, to the lessons the Navy drew from 2 defining moments of institutional humility. The first was the USS Stark incident on May 17, 1987, when an Iraqi Mirage F-1 fired 2 Exocet anti-ship missiles into the side of an Arleigh-Burke-class frigate predecessor, killing 37 American sailors. The Stark's phalanx close-in weapon system had been in standby mode. The crew hadn't classified the inbound aircraft as hostile. 37 men died because the ship's defensive architecture relied too heavily on human decision-making speed in a threat envelope that moved faster than human decision-making allowed. The Navy cataloged that lesson in blood. The second moment was the USS Vincennes incident on July 3, 1988. The same waters, the same theater, a different kind of failure. The Vincennes, operating under extreme electronic noise and the cognitive overload of an active surface engagement, misidentified Iran Air Flight 6055 as an attacking F-14 and destroyed it with 2 SM-2 surface-to-air missiles, killing all 290 civilians aboard. The lesson wasn't just procedural, it was systemic. The Navy's combat information systems were generating more data than any human crew could accurately process in real time. The answer to both failures pointed toward the same solution. The architecture had to be smarter than the adversary's ability to exploit human reaction time and human cognitive limits. That solution became the Aegis combat system. First deployed operationally aboard USS Ticonderoga, CG-47. In January 1983, Aegis was designed from its conceptual foundation as an integrated warfare system, not a collection of individual sensors and weapons networked loosely together, but a single, coherent, automated kill chain. The AN/SPY, one phased array radar, 4 fixed arrays, each 12.5 feet across, could simultaneously track over 100 targets in all weather conditions while maintaining fire control quality tracks on a subset of priority threats. By the time the Block I, Arleigh Burke destroyers were commissioned in the early 1990s, the Navy had begun iterating on Aegis with a velocity that Iran's defense establishment structurally could not match. Each upgrade cycle, Baseline 4, Baseline 7, Baseline 9, layered new capability onto the same hull platform, stretching the technological gap wider with every passing year. The AN/SPY 6W missile defense radar, the system now installed aboard the USS Jack H. Lucas, DDG-125, commissioned in 2023 as the first Flight 3 Arleigh Burke, represents a 35 times increase in radar sensitivity over the SPY-1D 35 times. The engineering team at Raytheon Technologies achieved this through a radical architectural departure. Rather than building one enormous fixed array, SPY-6 uses 37 modular radar module assemblies per face, each roughly the size of a large suitcase stacked and integrated into a single aperture. This modularity means the system can be repaired at sea by replacing individual RMAs without shutting down the entire radar face, a maintenance revolution that the Navy's surface warfare community had been requesting since the Stark era. The system can track targets at altitudes up to 100,000 feet and engage threats at ranges the Navy does not publicly confirm, though defense analysts cite engagement envelopes of over 200 nautical miles for the SM-6 missile in select flight profiles. Beneath the surface, literally, the Virginia-class fast attack submarine program completed a decade-long hull modification program that expanded the payload capacity of the Block 3 and Block 5 boats, with the Virginia payload module inserting a 70-foot plug section between the bow and sail that added 28 vertical launch system tubes to a hull that already carried 12 VLS cells in the bow. The USS North Dakota, SSN 784, and her successors now carry a weapons payload that in mass and variety exceeds what many surface combatants can deploy. More critically, they do it from a platform that generates acoustic signatures so low that the Navy's own testing ranges had to develop new detection methodologies to track them during sea trials. When the Navy says it has submarines in a theater, it means Iran has a problem it cannot solve with the sensor technology it actually possesses, not the sensor technology it believes it possesses. In January 2024, aboard the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, the operations tempo was punishing. The Ike CVN-69, a Nimitz-class carrier commissioned in 1977, operating far beyond her originally designed 50-year lifespan on the strength of $4 billion in midlife refueling and complex overhaul work, completed in 2005, though had been conducting sustained flight operations in the Red Sea for weeks. The Air Wing, Carrier Air Wing 3, was launching sorties at rates that hadn't been sustained since the early Iraq War years. Maintenance crews working 16-hour shifts in the heat of the carrier's engineering spaces were keeping aircraft flyable under conditions that tested every supply chain assumption the Navy had made during the peacetime deployment planning cycle. By mid-January, the Ike had successfully intercepted over a dozen Houthi anti-ship ballistic missiles and drone swarms, with her escort destroyers expending SM-2 and SM-6 missiles at a rate that triggered internal logistics reviews at NAVSEA headquarters in Washington. This is where the human element cuts deepest. The sailors aboard the escort destroyers average age 21 years old, many on their first deployment, some having joined the Navy during the COVID-era recruiting cycles when training pipelines were compressed and institutional knowledge transfer was imperfect. Were operating the most sophisticated air defense systems ever built under genuine combat conditions. The FIRECON, trawlmen and combat information centers were making engagement decisions on threat tracks that appeared, climbed, and closed in timelines measured in seconds. The doctrine said, trust the system. The training said, trust the system. But there is a difference between training room confidence and 0-20 hours in the Red Sea when your ship's radar is showing you an inbound ballistic track at Mach 3, and the engagement window is 8 seconds wide, and your commanding officer's voice on the net is calm, but you can feel the ship's frame vibrate as the SM-2 launcher rails train to bearing. The logistics friction was real and documented. The Navy publicly acknowledged concerns about SM-2 and SM-6 expenditure rates as early as February 2024. The missiles cost between $2.1 million and $4.3 million each, respectively. The production facilities, Raytheon's facility in Tucson, Arizona, were operating at peacetime manufacturing rates because the supply chain for solid fuel rocket motors, seeker heads, and guidance electronics had been optimized for cost efficiency, not wartime surge capacity. This was a systemic vulnerability that the operational tempo in the Red Sea exposed with painful clarity. NAVSEA initiated emergency production rate increase negotiations with Raytheon in the first quarter of 2024. But industrial-based realities meant that a meaningful increase in delivered missiles was a 24 to 36-month timeline. Minimum, the Navy was spending faster than the industrial base could reload. Meanwhile, the submarine element of the equation was operating in a fundamentally different strategic space. While the surface combatants absorbed attention, burned missiles, and generated the visible deterrence that dominated news coverage, the fast attack boats assigned to the theater, their numbers, classes, and patrol areas officially undisclosed, were doing what Virginia-class submarines do, be better than any platform in naval history: persistent, undetected intelligence collection and positioning. Iranian naval commanders knew, at an abstract level, that American submarines were in their operational environment. What they could not determine, what their sensor networks, shore-based sonar arrays, and surface patrol vessels could not resolve, was where. That uncertainty is not a minor operational inconvenience. That uncertainty is a paralysis mechanism. You cannot execute a coherent anti-access strategy when you cannot locate the most lethal element of the force you're trying to deny access to. There is a concept in strategic theory sometimes called the culminating point, the moment at which an attacker's momentum peaks and the balance of advantage begins to shift irreversibly toward the defender. Clausewitz wrote about it. Corbett refined it in the context of naval warfare. What happened in the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea through 2023 and 2024 was not, in the deepest sense, a contest between the United States and Iran. It was Iran discovering in real time, under operational stress, exactly where their culminating point had been, and it had been reached years earlier, not in a battle, but in a budget cycle, not in a crisis, but in a shipyard. The fundamental arithmetic of naval deterrence is this: the United States has spent approximately $800 billion on its Navy over the last 2 decades. Iran's entire annual defense budget in 2023 was roughly $10 billion. Iran has invested heavily in asymmetric capabilities, fast boat swarms, shore-based anti-ship missiles, mining doctrine, proxy force integration across the Houthi network and Hezbollah's coastal units, because symmetric competition was never a realistic option. These asymmetric investments are genuine, real, and dangerous to merchant shipping and poorly defended assets, but they operate against a surface fleet architecture that was specifically redesigned after the Stark and the Vincennes to defeat exactly these threat profiles: the Phalanx Block 1B, the Rolling Airframe Missile, the SM-6's Terminal Active Radar Homing Seeker. Every layer of the carrier strike group's defensive architecture traces a doctrinal line directly back to the lessons cataloged in the Persian Gulf in the 1980s. Iran's asymmetric strategy was met by an adversary that had spent 35 years building the specific answer to it. The deeper lesson, the one that strategic analysts will be studying long after the specific events of 2024 have faded from headlines, is about the nature of deterrence in the information age. Deterrence doesn't work the way it used to. During the Cold War, deterrence was about visible capability. Missiles on parade, carrier groups photographed, nuclear yields publicly declared. Today, the most powerful elements of deterrence are precisely the ones that cannot be seen. The submarine whose position is unknown, the electronic warfare suite whose capabilities are classified, the undersea communication relay that allows real-time coordination between assets spread across 500,000 square miles of ocean. Iran looked at the surface and saw a threat it believed it understood. It could not see the architecture beneath that surface, the electromagnetic, acoustic, and informational infrastructure that had been quietly assembled, upgraded, and positioned over decades. This is the defining truth of modern American naval power. The Navy's most decisive advantage is not in what it shows you. It is in what it has already done before you realize there is a contest. The USS Jack H. Lucas with her SPY-6 radar didn't need to fire a missile to change the strategic calculus in the Persian Gulf. Her presence in the theater, her ability to see what Iranian radar could not see, to track what Iranian sensors could not track, to engage at ranges that Iranian military planners had not incorporated into their operational models. That was the victory. Quiet, invisible, and already complete before the first crisis briefing was ever called. The Strait of Hormuz is still 21 miles wide. The tankers still move slowly through it every morning, but the loaded gun Iran thought it was pointing at the world's economy has, for anyone willing to look honestly at the architecture arrayed against it, always been pointed in the wrong direction. The Navy didn't win this one in the Red Sea. It won it in a Newport News shipyard in 2021, in a Tucson engineering lab in 2018, in a doctrine manual revision in 1989. That is the story of American sea power, not the battle that everyone watches, but the decades of preparation that made the outcome inevitable before the battle was ever named.